Hey everyone, this is Antriksh for Enterprise DNA, and in this video we are going to take a look at a piece of DAX code that you might have written in your DAX journey, and you might have as well been confused on how that code is actually working and how both row context and filter context are actually interacting with each other in just a single piece of DAX code. And that question was asked on the Enterprise DNA forum, and through this video I aim to explain how both row context and filter context actually interact with each other. And first of all, we are going to look at the code itself, then we are going to understand the theory, and at the end we are going to take a look at the behind the scene by using DAX Studio. So let's get started. The data model that we are going to use is basically a simple sales data model that contains dates, sales, and the products table. So the sales table contains transaction for each given day, and products table contains information about the products that were sold on that given day, and the dates table contains only a few columns. For the purpose of this video, we are only interested in the dates table, but we are going to use the sales table and the products table to explain how filter context and row context propagates with the help of relationships. So let's go back, and what we are going to do is we are going to create a measure that is going to be a running total because it contains both row context and the filter context. So let's create a new measure, and the running total will be a very basic one. So let's write running total, and we are going to write count rows over the filter, and I'm going to use the all function to return all the years that I have inside the dates table. So I can write dates calendar year number, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write, so first of all let's indent the code, and in the row context I'm going to write that dates calendar year number should be less than the max of the dates calendar year number. Let's close that, and let's close filter, and let's close count rows as well. So if I press enter and confirm the measure and bring that measure inside that table, you can see that we get a result that shows us that in 2006 we see that there is one year that is less than 2006. In 2007 we get 2 years, and similarly in 2011 we are reporting 6 because there are 6 calendar year numbers in that dates table that are less than the year 2011. So now that we have created that measure, let's try to understand how that piece of DAX code is actually working. So let's open that code editor, and you can see that first we have count rows, but that is not the first function that is getting evaluated or being executed. Then we have the filter function, then we have the all. So first thing in the evaluation order is of all. So all returns all the values, all the unique values of the dates calendar year number by ignoring any filter context that exists outside of the all function. So in the matrix we have the calendar year number column, and it is actively filtering that column, but since all is going to ignore the existing filter context, we are going to get all the unique values of that particular column. And in the second argument in the row context, we have written that dates calendar year number should be less than max dates calendar year number. Now in case if you are a new beginner and still trying to understand and learn DAX, you might think that both the references on the left hand side and inside the max function actually belong to the same column or the same table that we have inside the all function, but that is not true. The only part of the row context that actually belongs to the all function is the one that we have on the left hand side, and the one that we have on the max is getting evaluated inside a filter context and not the row context. So filter tries to create a row context on the table that you provide in the first argument, and this part of the code is actually retrieved from that particular row context. So for each row, filter iterates that table that we have inside all, and then we are able to access all the values that we are currently iterating. So at one iteration we only have one value, in the second iteration we have the second value. So if we are at 2006 we can only access 2006. In case we are at 2007, then we can only iterate on 2007, or you can say we can access only 2007. But when we write max, it is independent of the row context that we are creating using the filter function. So max is getting evaluated in the filter context that is being created by the calendar year number that we have used in that matrix. So when we are at 2006, max is going to return 2006, whereas the current row can be 2006, 2007 and 2008. And based on that Boolean operation, filter is going to return the table that actually satisfy the criteria that we are specifying in the second argument. And then we move on to 2007. Then in that case, max is going to return 2007. In 2008, it is going to return 2008. And depending upon all the values that are less than the value that is getting returned by the max function, filter is going to return a table. And in order to prove that max is actually not dependent on the row context, what we can do is segregate this piece of DAX code into several variables, and then we will be able to understand that the column reference on the left hand side and on the right hand side are not actually same. So let's create a variable, and I'm going to name it as something like var last visible date, maybe last visible year, is equal to max of the dates calendar year number. Then we can write var all years is equal to all dates calendar year number, and then we can write filter years. So here we are going to use the filter function. So let's cut the code and paste it here, and instead of all, I'm going to write all years, and instead of max, I'm going to write last visible year. And finally, we can create a new variable that will be result is equal to count rows of the filter years. And let's return this variable. So we can write result. And if I confirm the code, you can see that nothing changes. We still get the same running total that we were getting earlier. And in case if we go to the code and try to retrieve the value of the first variable, and let's confirm that. And you can see that for each row, we get the same year. For 2006, we get 2006. For 2009, we get 2009. So hopefully I was able to explain to you that the max function in this particular code doesn't actually depend upon the row context for its values. And in case if you want to simplify your understanding of the evaluation context, you can always break the code into several variables so that you can understand the evaluation order and how the code is getting executed. And before we move ahead, I want to give you some sort of mantra that you should always remember, that there are always two evaluation context. One is filter context. So let's go to the diagram view. So filter context only filters the model and it never iterates. So in case if I put a filter on the dates table, that filter context will filter the dates table, and through the relationships, we will be able to filter the sales table. But that filter will not propagate to the products table unless I change the nature of that relationship from unidirectional to bidirectional. But in terms of row context, if we are iterating on the dates table, then we do not filter the sales table. And in case if we are filtering the dates table, then we are not iterating the dates table. So just remember that filter context only filters the model and it does not iterate, and the row context only iterates a given table and it does not filters the table or the data model. So before we move ahead and look into the query plans that are getting executed behind the scene with the help of DAX Studio, there is one scenario that I want to show you in which the max function will actually depend upon the row context of that is created by the filter function. So let's go back to that measure. And in case if I go back and try to create a new measure, so let's duplicate that. And if I create and write 2 here, and instead of last visible year, I can here write that calculate max dates calendar year number. And if I close that and try to execute that code, and let's bring that into the matrix, and we also need to make sure that we are returning the correct variable. So let's do that. Let's click on confirm. You can see that we actually get a blank. So why do we actually get a blank for each cell? The thing is, we are iterating all the years, and what calculate does is it converts the currently iterated row into an equivalent filter context. So let's assume that we are at here and the current value that we are iterating on is 2005. What calculate will do is it will take that value and it will convert it into a filter context, and that in that filter context max will be evaluated and max will simply return 2005. Then we move on to 2006, we get 2006. Then we move on to 2007, calculate and max return 2007. And in case if I write equal to and click on confirm, you can see that we get 7, 7 and 7. So let me just create a new calculated table so that I can easily understand what is actually happening. So I can go back and create a new table, and I'm going to write add columns over the all dates calendar year number, and I can write max year, and here I'm going to write calculate over the max of the dates calendar year number. So let's close add columns, and you can see that for each row we are actually repeating the same value. For 2011 we get 2011, for 2010 we get 2010, and since these numbers are not strictly less than themselves, we are getting a blank. But when we use equal to, we are saying that all the values that are less than 2011, so that's why we get a 7. But in case if I remove the equal to sign, you can see that we are returning a blank because calculate is converting the currently iterated row into an equivalent filter context. So only in this case, when you use calculate, you are actually creating a dependency of the max function on the left hand side column that you have written in the iterator. Or in simpler terms, you can say that calculate is converting the currently iterated row context into a filter context, which is messing up our calculation. And you should also know that in case, even if you're using a measure reference such as something like max year, in that case as well, this code will not work. So let's just create a new measure, and I can name it as max year, and it will be simply a max dates calendar year number. So let's close that. And in the running total, instead of using the calculate construct, I'm going to call the max year measure. And if I click confirm, you can see that we still do not get anything, because when we write max year, we are simply writing calculate max dates calendar year number. A measure reference always has a calculate outside of it. So this measure is actually initiating context transition, that which actually converts the currently iterated row into a filter context. And in case if you are bound and you have to use a measure reference, what you can do is store that measure in a variable. So let's copy this and paste it here, and instead of the measure reference we can use the variable. And as you may know that variables are actually constant, and variable cannot create a context transition, so it cannot convert the row context into filter context. So if we click on confirm, you can see that we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So that was a quick demonstration of how row context and filter context are actually interacting with each other in our DAX code like that one. And what we can do next is go to DAX Studio to understand what actually happens behind the scene. So let's go to the external tools and let's launch DAX Studio. And what we need to do is connect to the Power BI file with the help of query plans and the server timings. So let's wait for the trace to complete, and then we can minimize these windows. And what I'm going to do is create a query measure. So I can write define measure in the dates table. Just make sure that the spelling is correct. So I can write dates running total. And then I'm going to use the original code that we had. So I can write count rows over the filter all dates calendar year number, and in the row context we are going to write that the dates calendar year number should be less than the max dates calendar year number. So let's close filter, let's close count rows, and let's zoom out a little bit. And what we are going to do is, since we are supposed to return a table, we can write evaluate. Then we are going to create the table using the summarize columns. So we are going to write dates calendar year number and the virtual column, which will be the running total. And then we are going to call our running total measure. And here I can write something like DT as a DAX Studio keyword. So let's write DT and let's close summarize columns. And if I execute this code, you can see that the code is complete, and we still get the same result that we have seen inside Power BI. So let's go to the query plan to understand what is actually happening behind the scene. And in fact, if the max function is actually dependent on the row context or not, we can actually understand from the query plans. So let's go to the logical query plan, because the physical query plan is generally more complex and is a bit difficult to read, and you won't actually spend too much time in reading that part. So let's zoom in a little bit, and you can see that the first operator on the first line we see is group semi-join, that is used by the summarize column to create an inner join between this column and the another column that we have created inside summarize column. Then for joining those columns, there is a scan of a vertipack. Vertipack is the storage engine that we have inside analysis services, and you can see that it says that we need a column which is dates, calendar year number. So if I go back to Power BI, you can see that on the matrix, we have this calendar year number column, which is acting as the axis of our report. So let's go to DAX Studio. And in order to populate that axis, we need a column which is required, which is actually marked as required calls, dates, calendar year number, and just pay attention to the number that is listed before that, which is 0 in this case. Then we have the count rows function in our measure. So we have the count rows as a top level operator. Then count rows calls the filter function. Then for filter, there is a scan of the vertipack again, which says that required call is dates, calendar year number. So just pay attention to this line and this line. You can see that both lines say the same thing, that we need a column which is dates, calendar year number, but the first one is marked with the 0 and the second one is marked with a 1. So that means that the column that we are accessing with the help of all function is extracted separately from the column that we have inside the summarize column function. Then there is a less than operator because of this. Then we can see that there is a comparison between the row context and the max function. So we have the max vertipack. So we are actually extracting the max value from the storage engine. And towards the right, you can see that here it says depends on call, dates, calendar year number. So this is the most important thing that we need to remember, that it says depends on calls, dates, calendar year number. So you can remember that earlier I said that there is no dependency of the max function on the row context, and this is what actually proves it. So here it says 0, and where did we find 0? On the top in the second line, which is being extracted for the summarize columns. So that means if I go back to Power BI, the max function doesn't depend on the row context, but it is actually depending upon the column that we have inside that table. So that table is actually creating the filter context. So indirectly, max function is dependent on the filter context and not the row context. So let's go back to DAX Studio once again. And you can see that for calculating the max vertipack, we have a scan of vertipack, which says that depends on call, 0, dates, calendar year number, and then there are several other columns that required columns. We do not need to pay attention to that, but for the purpose of our understanding, we just need to know that max is not dependent on the row context for this particular code. So now we can actually take a look at the variable version of the code. So to understand the flow of the code, and let's go back to Power BI, and I'm going to copy this code, and let's go to DAX Studio and let's replace the current version of the code. And I'm going to indent the code so that it is easier to read. And instead of returning the last visible year, I'm going to return the count rows version or the result variable. And if I press F5 and go to the results pane, you can see that we still get the same exact result. And let's go to the query plan. And this time the query plan is a bit longer, but it is much easier to read. So you can see that first we have a group semi-join operator that will join these two columns. Then we have the scanning of the vertipack for the dates, calendar year number that we have written inside the summarize columns function. Then there is a var scope operator that says that from here onwards, the scope of the variable will start. So we have used a lot of variables that will start from here. And you can see that measure reference is written as running total DT. So the first thing on the line 4, we see that is max vertipack, because the first variable is actually calculating the max of the dates, calendar year number column. Then we have the max of the vertipack. For calculating the max, there is a scan of the vertipack, which says that it depends upon the column dates, calendar year number, which is marked as 0, and 0 is also the column that we have inside summarize column. So that clears that the max function is actually dependent on the filter context and not the row context. And then we can see that for filter, we have a scanning of the vertipack, which says that all years, and it says that depends on calls, nothing, because we are using the all function. So it doesn't depend on the existing filter context. That's why we do not see anything for the depends on call. But for the required calls, it says that 1, dates, calendar year number. And that number is actually different from the number that we have seen for the column that we're extracting for the summarized columns. And then in the row context, you can see that it says less than dates calendar year number, and somewhere here it should also have the last visible year function. So you can see that here filter is trying to compare the row context and the max value that we have retrieved from the filter context. And once the table is returned by the filter, count rows simply counts the table that is returned by the filter variable, which is the filter years. So here you can see that it says that variable name is result, and somewhere here it says that reference variable name is filter years. So count rows is going to count the filter years variable, and that is how that particular piece of code is going to be evaluated and executed. So before wrapping up, let's take a look at the calculate version of the code as well, so that we can cover all the scenarios. So let's go to Power BI, and I'm going to copy this piece of DAX code, and let's go back to DAX Studio. Let's zoom out a little bit and let's paste the code here. And what I'm going to do is, instead of last visible year, I'm going to write this measure reference. So let's execute the code by pressing F5, and let's increase the width of that window. And what you can see that first we get the scanning of the vertipack, which gets the column for the summarized columns. Then inside max, you can see that here it says that it actually depends on one date's calendar year number. And then in the scanning of the vertipack, it says that it also depends on one date's calendar year number. So what is the one here? One is something that you can find on the line 4, which says that all years depends on calls nothing. Then we have the required calls one date's calendar year number. So earlier we saw that the max function was not dependent on anything, but now since we have used the calculate function, there is a dependency on the existing column that we have on the left hand side of the tree. So in simpler terms, I mean that the row context. So what calculate is doing is it is converting the currently iterated value into the filter context, because of which we see that there is a depend on calls one date's calendar year number. So hopefully by this video, I was able to explain how a given function can interact with the row context and cannot interact with the row context, and how the max in this case was actually evaluated in the filter context and not the row context. And just always remember that the filter context actually filters the whole model, and the row context only iterates the given table and never filters a model, and the filter context doesn't iterate a table. And in case if you found this video helpful, just wait for our DAX Studio course that we are going to release very soon, where we are going to go into much deeper in similar scenarios, and we teach you how you can optimize your DAX code. And that was all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Enterprise DNA TV. If you enjoyed the content covered in this particular tutorial, please throw the video a like. It really helps us and we really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Enterprise DNA TV channel. We have a huge amount of content coming out all the time from myself and a range of content creators, all dedicated to improving the way that you use Power BI and the Power Platform. Lastly, check out Enterprise DNA's website, plenty of resources and further learning that you can access very easily. All the best. Take care.